Hello, everyone, and welcome to Pennsylvania's Energy Alphabet, the next webinar in our Clean Energy for All series. We're going to be practicing accessible, inclusive self-introductions tonight. So what you're going to hear from four of us are our name and role, our pronouns, our location and land acknowledgement, as well as a description of our visual appearance and surroundings. We have links to learn more about all of these pieces. We encourage everyone to introduce yourself in the chat, but please feel free to only include the information that you're comfortable sharing or not introduce yourself at all, right? We recognize that some of these components might be new for you all. All right, so my name is Melissa Farr. I am the Senior Distributed Organizer for Sierra Club Pennsylvania. I use she, her pronouns. I'm located in South Central Pennsylvania, which is the land of the Susquehannock. I am a white woman in her 30s with wavy brown shoulder-length hair. I am wearing a rainbow striped blazer and a necklace that's made out of wood. My background is an abstract piece of art against a blue wall. We will hear next from Tom Schuster, who is going to be speaking for the most of this session. And then we're also going to hear from Sarah Corcoran, who is going to be watching chat, handling people who are in the waiting room. If you have any technical questions, please go ahead and put them in chat for Sarah. And then we also will hear from Nate Regal, who's going to be watching chat for any policy questions that you may have. He's our Clean Energy Program advocate. So with that, I will turn it over to the three of them to introduce themselves to you. So Tom, go right ahead.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Tom Schuster. I use he/him pronouns. I'm the director of the Pennsylvania chapter of Sierra Club. I'm coming to you from Johnstown, Pennsylvania, which is the land of the Lenape and Shawnee. And I am pictured here about 15 years ago. Still have the goatee and glasses. A lot grayer than I am in that picture. And I'll turn it over to Sarah.
Hey everyone, my name is Sarah Corcoran. I use she, her pronouns. I'm calling in from Northeast Pennsylvania, the land of the Lenape people. I am the Deputy Director of the Pennsylvania chapter of the Sierra Club. I am a white woman with a light gray shirt. My hair is currently a dirty blonde and is pulled back. I have glasses and my background is blurred. And I will go ahead and pass it off to Nate.
All right. Hello, I'm Nate Regal. I'm the Clean Energy Program advocate for the chapter. I use he, him pronouns, and I have a note here so I don't forget. I'm right outside of Harrisburg in the Susquehannock land. And okay, let's see some descriptors here. I am a white male in his 40s, and I'm looking at my picture as I say this. So I have a shaved head, a little bit of, we'll say, a scruffy beard, not a really good one, and a gray vest and a blue flannel shirt because I'm in a basement, which you can't see because it's blurred and it's cold down here.
I like the extra sensory experience that Nate has brought us with I'm currently quite warm. All right, thank you all. We are also going to be putting the slide deck into the chat. So if you would like to follow along, some of the slides do have links that you can click if you'd like. You will also get those slides through email in the next couple of days, so you'll have access to them in the future. With that, let's move along here. Zoom setup, please keep yourself on mute if you're not speaking. Feel free to turn on your camera if you're comfortable, but do note that we are recording. Use the chat to ask questions about the content or for technical help. You can do that as we go through this, or you can wait until the end. Closed captioning is running, so you can turn that on. And then when we do get to the question and answer period at the end, the raised hand function under the reactions menu is a great way to get in line to ask your question or make your comment. We also have a few community agreements. We want you to engage with kindness. All forms of discrimination won't be tolerated. Please speak from your own experience. If you find yourself speaking a lot, be sure to leave space for others. We do have limited time tonight. We're going to try not to use jargon, acronyms, and industry language. This entire premise of this is that there's too many acronyms, right? We're trying to explain them, but please call us on that if we use an acronym and you need an explanation. Because of time, again, we may ask you to continue a conversation outside of the event. And if we don't have all of the answers tonight, we will certainly follow up with you as needed. And if you have a question about something that Sierra Club is working on that's not on topic tonight, again, feel free to email us. We can connect outside of this space. And as always, approach the ideas presented tonight with an open mind. We're anticipating a lively discussion. Our Clean Energy for All series, we run these pretty much every other month, 5 to 6 times a year. The focus is to look at those critical energy issues that Pennsylvania is facing and ensure that there's a just, clean energy transition for all. If you're interested in watching past episodes or just staying tuned with what we're doing in the future, bookmark our page here. This is a link that I don't know if I pulled this for Sarah to put into the chat, but we will certainly get to you so that you can check in with those past episodes. And then our objectives today are pretty straightforward. We want to define and describe Pennsylvania's new energy policy proposals, compare those to the new proposals with what has existed in the past, and then figure out what the best recipe is for Pennsylvania's clean energy transition. I'm sure we're not going to land on that tonight. That'd be great if we did and we've solved all the problems, but we're certainly going to, try out some ingredients. I'm going to stick with our cooking analogy here tonight. You're going to see a lot of that. Indulge me with my whimsical slides. And so with that, I will turn it over to Tom to walk us through the meat of this webinar. Take it away, Tom.
All right, thank you, Melissa, and thank you for the wonderful theme of tonight's presentation. Certainly a lot more interesting than the dry slides that I put together. We're going to be talking mostly about a couple of components of Governor Shapiro's energy plan. The quote here, we're kind of in all of the above energy state. And that's something that he says himself quite a bit. It does kind of make me roll my eyes, but honestly, it's not something that he has invented or is really kind of pushing on us. It's really, I think, a reflection of where the politics of Pennsylvania are. And so what we're going to see in these proposals is, not perfect pieces of legislation, but things that we think will advance our climate goals if we're able to achieve them. And so we do support them at this time, and we're hoping that we can recruit folks to help us get these bills passed, but we are cognizant of the fact that they could be better, and we'll be working to improve them. Next slide. So there's 4 main parts of Governor Shapiro's energy plan. The first piece is the 2 hydrogen hubs that include parts of Pennsylvania, the Mid-Atlantic Clean Hydrogen Hub, or MACH2 in the southeast, which also includes Delaware and parts of New Jersey, and then the Appalachian Regional Clean Hydrogen Hub, or ARCH2, which is centered in West Virginia, but includes a number of projects in southwestern Pennsylvania. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on hydrogen tonight, just to say that the ARCH2 project is something that we pretty much oppose across the board because it uses fossil methane, fracked gas primarily to create the hydrogen. And then the MACH2 is a little bit different because it does propose to use all fossil-free sources to create the hydrogen. But still proposes some end uses of hydrogen that are not terribly efficient. So it's something we're engaging with and trying to make better, but not supporting wholeheartedly. Abandoned well capping is another thing that the governor is very supportive of. We are working on that as well. We're working on it in a little bit different capacity. He's trying to spend federal money to cap wells. We are trying to make sure that the rules related to bonding or financial assurances on new wells is enough to make sure that taxpayers are not on the hook if those companies go bankrupt. But we're going to spend most of the time on the Pennsylvania Reliable Energy Sustainability Standard, or PRESS. I hate saying that whole thing. I am going to say PRESS from here on in, which is a replacement for our Alternative Energy Portfolio Standard, which we'll explain in a minute. And then the Pennsylvania Climate Emissions Reduction Act, or PACER, which, you know, someone rearranged the letters to come up with that acronym, but I don't know, maybe they thought we were British. Next slide. Okay, so if you've been working with us over the past 10, 12 years, you're probably familiar with the Alternative Energy Portfolio Standard, or AEPS. That is our requirement that utilities and energy suppliers purchase a certain percentage of clean or otherwise alternative energy on behalf of their customers. This was adopted in 2004, and it is, as these images suggest, it has exceeded its useful life. Next slide. So these rules, when they were adopted, they required us to ramp up energy purchases across several tiers. So the first tier includes mostly clean sources of energy, and capped or maxed out at about 8%, actually 8% by 2021. The second tier included a number of sources that were although they were alternative, they were not necessarily green. They include things like waste coal and large hydro. And actually, that's a majority of what was required at 10%. Within the first tier, there was a carve out of 0.5% for solar energy. Next slide. So within tier one, these are the types of energy that were required. They still are required. There's still 8% required, but because that's not growing anymore, it's not really driving any more new investment in these areas. It's also important to note that tier one sources of energy, with the exception of solar, can be from anywhere within the regional grid, which includes parts of 13 states around Pennsylvania. Next slide. All right, and so tier two, there's a lot of bad stuff in here. Waste coal, we burn waste coal at about 10 power plants in Pennsylvania to generate electricity. These are smaller coal plants, but because what they're burning is lower energy content, their pollution levels are even higher than regular coal plants. They do purport to clean up abandoned waste coal piles, which is a good thing in theory, but it's questionable as to whether the benefits outweigh the costs there. Also, you'll see biomass in here, solid waste incineration, and then this last one, integrated combined coal gasification technology. That's actually a new type of coal boiler that never really came to fruition. So none of that ever got built, but it's still in there. So this would be replaced by PRESS, the Pennsylvania Reliable Energy Sustainability Standard, which was clearly developed to just spell out PRESS. It does not roll off the tongue. but it's been introduced as House Bill 2277 by Representative Otten. And we will talk about how that changes our clean energy standards. So right now we have 66 co-sponsors, which is the majority of the Democratic caucus. We don't have any Republicans signed on to this bill right now. We are trying to drive additional co-sponsors to this bill. At a high level, this bill would greatly increase our requirements of clean energy under Tier 1 from 8% to 35% over the next 10 years. And it would also make some changes to what qualifies in Tier 1 and Tier 2 and creates a new Tier 3. The combined effect of which is actually mostly better for good sources of energy and worse for bad sources of energy. And I'll explain that in the next slide. Here's kind of the big picture of how a generation in the state would look once this policy is fully implemented. So on the left-hand side, you can see the pie chart that breaks down what percentage of our electricity comes from what currently. We generate about a third of our electricity from nuclear energy, just shy of 50% from uncontrolled fossil, and then the alternative Tier 1 and Tier 2 are 18%. And under press, that Tier 1 would grow. The total of the three tiers would be 50%. It would strive to maintain the same level of nuclear energy and reduce uncontrolled fossil to 17%. And this is, again, over the next 10 years. So, and I should say too, if anybody has any questions about anything that I'm saying here that is really like stumping you and causing you to not understand, and it's a clarifying question, feel free to raise your hand and I can try to answer that. If it's a more in-depth question about why something is the way it is, then we can wait till the end. Comparison of the tiers in these. So just a kind of code of the colors here. Things that are in orange letters are an improvement or a good change compared to the AEPS. Things that are in the dark blue are what Sierra Club would consider a bad change. And then things that are in purple are things that we're not quite sure what to make of it yet. We don't know exactly what the implications would be, but probably the impact is not going to be that big. So in Tier 1, obviously the amount going up is good, from 8 to 35%. Distributed generation, which is small scale solar, things like the solar you might put on your rooftop, or systems that a school might install on their grounds. Anything that is net metered directly by the customer would count in Tier 1 this time. A lot of what's in Tier 1 is not changing. They are adding fusion energy, which remains to this day science fiction. It is a form of nuclear energy that fuses atoms really, instead of splitting them. It is considered by the Atomic Energy Agency to be safer than our current forms of nuclear energy. And doesn't produce the kinds of radioactive waste. It's not commercially viable. It's not clear that it ever will be commercially viable. And so really in the next 10 years, it's probably not particularly meaningful here. So that's why we left that as purple. The thing that we don't particularly like about Tier 1 is they've added something called advanced nuclear energy, including small modular reactors. These are they're fission units, so they're units that utilize uranium fuel, but they are, instead of being built as big projects on site like like plants like 3 Mile Island and Limerick. They're smaller units that could even, I think, be built in a factory and installed somewhere. And those are not yet commercially viable either, but have a higher likelihood, I think, of coming online sometime within the next 10 years. So that's not something we're thrilled with either, but we can talk about why it's not a deal breaker in the discussion. Next slide. Okay, so tier 2 actually includes a number of good changes compared to the current tier 2. One bad change, though, is that it does allow, for the first time, coal or gas-fired power plants that are 80% carbon capture or co-fired with hydrogen. And so that's not something we support. That is something that was developed to mirror new federal policy on regarding climate pollution emissions limits for power plants. And it is something that organized labor supports because they are afraid of losing jobs at power plants. Some of the good changes, some sources of energy that we didn't like that were previously in tier 1, including fuel cells and biomass energy, are downgraded. Fuel cells are not necessarily bad, but fuel cells use a chemical reaction to either create energy from hydrogen or directly from methane without combusting it. And this doesn't specify which, so that could be a fossil fuel technology. They're downgraded from tier 1. Biomass, importantly, is downgraded from tier 1. Storage co-located with a tier 1 resource is a new addition, which is good. It competes with these other dirtier technologies. And importantly, number 9 here, tier 1 reliable energy sources. This is something that the administration refers to as the waterfall. This was actually an idea that we came up with a couple of years ago. And what it does is it allows for cleaner sources to compete if tier 1 ends up, if the target ends up not being ambitious enough and there's more available electricity than there are credits to be had, they can compete with these dirtier sources in tier 2. And that also means that we are not necessarily locked into getting 10% of our power from these dirty sources. It could come from those cleaner tier 1 sources. Next slide. Tier 3, this is a new tier altogether. It includes mostly things that were downgraded from the previous tier 2. And the total amount is smaller. So that's good. The one bad thing is that it includes, again, gas and coal-fired power plants at only 20% carbon capture or hydrogen blending. But at 5%, this is unlikely, we think, to really drive any additional investment in these technologies. And in fact, it's probably going to cause some of the waste coal, which is currently heavily subsidized by tier 2, or incinerators, trash incinerators, municipal solid waste, to no longer get the same level of subsidy that they got in the past. And the waterfall exists here again. Tier 1 sources also qualify for tier 3. And so in theory, if we're building enough clean energy, it could satisfy up to 50% of our power by 2035. Okay. Couple other important things. Generators that power cryptocurrency mining are not eligible for credits. There are at least 2 power plants, actually, there are 2 waste coal plants and part of 1 nuclear plant that are completely dedicated to mining Bitcoin and nothing else. And those waste coal power plants still receive credits under the AEPS. It's a huge subsidy. And they probably wouldn't be able to do that without it. If you aren't familiar with the power consumption of cryptocurrency, globally, it is more than some middle-sized developed countries. It's ridiculous. So if you are an environmentalist, you should not be buying Bitcoin. If you care about climate, you should not be buying Bitcoin. We should be doing everything that we can to get rid of it. Tier 3, the allowable price for credits, which is the compliance mechanism for this, is $15 instead of $45. That means that is essentially the maximum subsidy they could receive under this policy. So capping it lower means that it's going to be less of an incentive to keep those online or develop new ones. Tier 2 and Tier 3 in this press bill have to be from in-state sources, but Tier 1 can still be from out-of-state sources, but there is an in-state requirement that's phased in. So over time, it will encourage more of the clean energy to be developed in Pennsylvania. The reason why it allows out-of-state right now is partly because the renewable energy developers are concerned that they're not going to be able to meet the demand. They're not going to be able to ramp up quickly enough to meet the demand. So it does allow for regional sources there. Next slide. Okay, and the last thing on press, and this is a controversial aspect of it. It includes a zero energy credit for existing nuclear. It is essentially a way to prevent the price of nuclear energy from dropping below a certain level. Now, the actual effect of this, I think, is going to be fairly minimal over the next 10 years because there is a federal policy that essentially does the same thing. And units that qualify for the federal tax credits are not going to be able to double dip and take the ZEC in Pennsylvania. But nevertheless, it's in here, and I think that's partly to satisfy some legislators, mostly Republicans, who have nuclear plants in their districts that are worried about them potentially closing, and also to hopefully garner some more union support. So this is a policy that is a standalone policy Sierra Club would definitely oppose. But when it is kind of coupled with a package, we are able to kind of assess it as a whole, and look at whether the benefits outweigh the costs. And based on the current draft, we believe that the benefits would outweigh the environmental liabilities. Okay, so that's press. Now we're going to switch gears. We're going to talk about PACER. So PACER is essentially a replacement for the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. Now, this is a policy that we have been focused on since October of 2019, when Governor Wolf issued an executive order to start a rulemaking process to get Pennsylvania into the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which I will explain on the next slide fairly quickly. So what RGGI does is it sets a cap on carbon emissions from power plants over 25 megawatts. That cap declines over time, and every power plant that emits a ton of carbon dioxide has to buy a credit. Credits are only available for the amount of tons under the cap. And when they pay for that, the money goes into a fund. And the next slide shows kind of how graphically how that works, right? So the cap does decline over time. Polluters pay for their credits, and then the fund that's generated pays for community investments and things in Pennsylvania, things that will reduce air pollution, and that could be renewable energy projects, it could be energy efficiency. Other states do other things with it. Some states use it for things like climate resilience, green infrastructure, flood protection, things like that. So the problem with Reggie is it did become law in 2022. It was finalized. It was immediately challenged in court. And it was ultimately struck down in Commonwealth Court. The Commonwealth Court said that it was an unlawful tax on power plants. We disagree with that assessment. We believe that the DEP does have authority to charge a fee for a unit of pollution under the Air Pollution Control Act. Governor Shapiro agreed with that assessment, appealed to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, and it sits there right now. The court has not taken action on it yet. They've not even issued a briefing schedule, unfortunately, and it's been 6 months since the appeal. So the future is actually unknown. I think, given the makeup of the court and the court the decisions regarding the environment that the court has handed down in recent years, we stand a pretty good chance of prevailing there, but it is court and you just don't know. By the way, we are attempting to intervene in that. We tried to intervene at Commonwealth Court. They wouldn't let us. They said DEP represented our interests adequately, which we disagreed with, and appealed that decision to the Supreme Court. And so hopefully we can get in and help defend that also. So you may recall Governor Shapiro, when he was running for office, was never really a huge fan of Reggie. And that's in large part because the trade unions did not like Reggie. And he, feels that he needs their support politically. So what he did in his first year in office was establish this Reggie working group, which was included representatives from both sides of the issue, some environmental groups, some labor groups, some industry groups, some consumer advocates. And they met famously outside of the public eye. They didn't want them to be public meetings because they didn't want people to grandstand. They wanted people to get down into the real issues and reasons why they liked or didn't like it, and try to come up with a path forward. Governor Shapiro is always talking about his three-part test of protecting clean energy jobs, taking action to address climate change, and then ensuring reliable, affordable power for consumers in the long term. And we always say Reggie meets that test, and here's why. So then the working group convened, and they essentially found the same thing without saying they support Reggie. So the consensus was that we need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, cap and invest regulation that generates revenue to support an energy transition would be the optimal approach. Sounds like Reggie. But they found some things to nitpick about Reggie, basically. And they said that really this should be a regional policy, but not regional with the rest of the northeastern states, regional with PJM states, which is the grid that we directly trade electricity with, which includes a lot of more conservative states that are never going to adopt a policy like this. But there were a lot of good things in that working group report that were supportive of the policy and kind of undermined some of the opposition arguments against Reggie. So Governor Shapiro and his staff took that and came up with this idea called PACER, Pennsylvania Climate Emission Reduction Act, introduced as House Bill 2275 by Representative Abney, pictured here. And so this is very much like Reggie. There are two key differences here between Reggie and the PACER law, and we will get into those on the next slide. So PACER is still a cap and trade program. It is a Pennsylvania only cap and trade program. So what it does is it gives DEP a couple of months to decide whether or not the cap in the existing regulation needs to be changed based on impacts to consumers, the environment, and jobs. They may decide not to change it following this process, but if they don't maintain comparable stringency with the rest of RGGI, then the credits wouldn't be tradable. If they do, then the credits would be tradable, and there wouldn't be much discernible difference. Next slide. Another big difference, though, is that the proceeds would be used much differently. So currently under RGGI, the proceeds go into something called the air pollution reduction fund. And that has to be used for things that reduce air pollution, as the name suggests. However, in this case, the proceeds would mostly be used to provide rebates to consumers through the consumer protection account, and then these other three smaller accounts, which are outlined on the next slides. So as far as consumer protection goes, the Public Utility Commission develops a program by which all electric customers would receive a bill credit, a specific line item. And that is designed to undercut arguments that RGGI is going to raise prices on consumers, which have been overblown from the start. But this would actually cause it to directly save them money. The low income support account is set aside for additional funds for the low income energy assistance program that helps pay for weatherization and direct payment assistance, direct bill assistance for folks who have trouble affording their energy bills, and also specifically provides for cooling assistance, because that is becoming air conditioning is becoming less of a luxury and more of a necessity as the planet warms, and is becoming increasingly difficult for low-income folks, especially in urban heat islands, to afford. Next slide. The Pennsylvania Energy Transformation Account is 10% of the proceeds, 40% of which have to be spent in designated environmental justice communities. This is to eliminate air pollution, similar to what the Clean Air Fund would have done, but it limits the type of eligible projects a little bit compared to the Clean Air Fund. This list here provides a list of the types of eligible projects, most of which are good. Carbon capture and utilization, not so great. We don't really want to be subsidizing that. But most of the other ones, I think most folks would agree, are generally good things that we would support, except we're not sure what fuel switching means. That's why I put it in quotes. Switching from gas to electric, good. Switching from electric to gas, not so good. And the bill doesn't specify. Next slide. And then finally, the Workforce Enhancement Fund. And this is, it doesn't use the word union jobs, but it seems designed to try to create union energy jobs in a sort of clean energy economy, but it requires prevailing wage, and it involves repurposing retired power plants for new energy projects. Those might be good projects, they might be bad projects. It also includes carbon capture and so-called clean hydrogen, which is using the federal standard to define clean, which does involve some carbon capture if it's blue hydrogen. Also includes solar, which is great. Well capping, again, major theme. We have 300,000 plus abandoned wells in Pennsylvania. We'll never have enough money to do all of that, right? And also potentially some money for pollution control at existing power plants, combustion power plants, as long as they continue to exist. Next slide. So this is a bit more of a mixed bag for us. It is something I think that we support right now. It's kind of being dealt with as a package with PACER because of the affordability argument. The good thing is that it would take RGGI out of the courts. It would create an alternative that is not subject to the same legal arguments that the executive order that created RGGI is subject to. Legislation is always more durable than regulation. We saw this when Trump came in 2017 and undid a whole bunch of Obama era rules, and then Biden came in 2020 and undid a whole bunch of Trump era rules. That can happen in Pennsylvania as well. So if we get a governor in the future who is less supportive of RGGI, they could initiate a rule making to roll it back, or simply sign into law legislation that that would repeal it. So by getting it passed through the legislature and getting more buy-in from the legislature makes it a lot more durable. And then the third thing, and this is an issue that is kind of a wild card. Every 4 years or so, sometimes longer, the RGGI states get together and change what their cap level is. And all those other states have much more ambitious clean energy targets than we do. They may set a cap that's really ambitious, and that may cause even people in Pennsylvania who support RGGI in the legislature and in the governor's office to really get some heartburn. And we may have to go through a rulemaking process every time those caps are changed to revise our own caps to stay in RGGI, and that's by no means guaranteed. And by having a Pennsylvania specific program, we avoid that problem. The negatives. RGGI is a more efficient policy. Having a regional trading system means that your lowest cost emissions get reduced first. So it's just less costly to implement. Investing more reserves in clean energy as opposed to direct bill credits achieves our goals faster. So that's a negative of this. And then it's not clear, kind of the flip side of that whole issue with RGGI states lowering their caps. It's unclear exactly how easy it's going to be to ratchet down the emissions cap post 2030 in Pennsylvania with PACER. So where do we go from here? As I said, there's majority Democrat support in the House. If leadership decides to push a vote on this, it would probably pass. The future in the Senate is less clear. It won't get through in this session. The Republicans oppose it. But if we're able to close or eliminate the gap in the Senate, then reintroduction could happen next year. And even if the Republicans still control things, having a close margin could make for some negotiating leverage that could allow it to be passed, perhaps as part of a deal for the 2025 budget. But before that, we do want to get involved in trying to shore up some of the more questionable provisions of these bills. But bear in mind that overall, as a package, we definitely think that these would be an improvement over the status quo, and are pushing for the advancement of these bills. Next slide. So we are hoping for and expecting lots of hearings, more than the typical number of legislative hearings. None have been scheduled yet, but the idea is to hopefully convince leadership to take this on the road and not just do a typical legislative hearing where they call a few witnesses, but to actually let the public speak on this. And if we're able to do that, similar to the way hearings were held for the RGGI rule, that can be something that we can turn people out for and try to demonstrate support for this policy. And also helps us to control the narrative and talk about why it's important to increase our clean energy usage. And in the short run, we are trying to educate legislators, drive additional co-sponsors, and ask you all to talk to your representatives to get them to sign on if they're not already. So I'm going to turn it back to Melissa, who's going to talk about a couple of specific things, including further actions we can take on this issue.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tom. So folks, if you want to stay up to date with all of this, and by up to date, I mean every single week, we are going to be holding our briefing series, which is a 30-minute legislative update with Jen Quinn, our legislative and political director. This is going to be weekly starting Tuesday, May 28th. It's at 5 p.m. every single week until the legislature breaks for summer recess. So this is where you're going to get all of the good insights into what's happening with PACER and press. Included in these resources is also our target list of legislators that we're hoping you'll reach out to encourage them to co-sponsor, right? So if you want those resources, check out the briefing webpage. We'll get that link for you in the chat. We're also hoping you'll join us for Virtual Citizens Lobby Day. So Penn Environment has this every single year. Sierra Club is co-sponsoring this year. If you haven't already registered through Penn Environment or another org or through us, please give this a shot. Sign up through the link we have here. This is the easiest way to meet with your lawmakers. If you've never done a lobby visit before, this is the perfect introduction. You're going to be scheduled for a 30 to 60-minute commitment on Thursday, June 6th. Someone is going to be in the meeting with you. There are going to be other folks from your communities in those meetings, so you're not alone. You're going to be given all the tips and talking points, everything that you need, right? So it's a super easy way to get started, and you can do it from your home in your pajamas, right? So if you're interested in that, please sign up at that link. We would love to have you. And then we have some volunteer teams that may be of interest if you want to stay up to date on these topics. So the Clean Energy Conservation Team, the link there will take you to their next meeting. We also have our chapter advocacy team, which does a lot of rapid response, letter writing, lawmaker outreach. That's kind of where our citizen lobbying work lives. The link there will take you to their next meeting. And then we always have a monthly volunteer open house. So if you're just not sure how to get involved with us, sign up for a volunteer open house. We'll go over all the different ways that you can engage with Sierra Club Pennsylvania. We have a final acronym review slide. So we will put the slide deck into the chat one more time so that you can turn to this slide while we're doing Q&A, and you can have this handy if you need to reference your acronyms again. You know, because obviously you didn't memorize all of that right now, right? So let's dig into some Q&A. I'm going to back out of screen sharing. Let's see here. I'm going to first ask Sarah if there are any lingering questions from the chat that need to be held up into the space for Tom before we go to raised hands. Sarah, do we have any questions that we're waiting on?
Nate has been handling the questions like a champ. So there are quite a few back and forths located there if you haven't been following along. He's got a bunch of answers in the chat. But there is not anything new that has come out. We did have one that just popped up asking to summarize pros and cons of press like you did for PACER.
Sure. And they're largely pros. It's a huge increase in the amount of clean energy that we would see. Just to put it in perspective, to get to 35% even for tier 1 requires essentially adding the current level, because remember the clean energy can come from out of state within our regional grid. And so actually only 3% of our generation comes from renewable energy in state right now. And it would increase by almost 3% every year until 2035. So essentially adding what we currently have now every year. That's the big pro. The cons of press are I would say relative to the status quo, which is the alternative energy portfolio standard, the only major con has to do with nuclear. That's the ZEC program, the zero energy credit for existing nuclear, which could theoretically keep those plants online longer, but not really past their current licensing date. So I don't think that's going to have a huge environmental impact. It could result in the construction of more small modular reactors, which climate activists debate the merits of nuclear energy. The Sierra Club Board of Directors at its last board meeting just recently reaffirmed our policy against supporting nuclear energy. And so again, as a standalone bill, we would oppose this, but since it is kind of part of this larger clean energy package, we do have flexibility, and I am 100% convinced that this is going to drive a lot more wind and solar than it does nuclear.
Peter has his hand raised.
Yeah, Tom, I think you sort of answered my question, talking about 3% of the power every year has to come from sources within Pennsylvania. I'm just curious if there are ways for a fossil fuel power generator to continue operating by buying out-of-state RECs, or I'm not quite sure what the right terms are, but being able to continue to operate by buying stuff out of state to say, oh, well, I'm providing all these credits or whatever. Is there protection from that, or?
Yeah, well, that's not really how the compliance works. So the fossil fuel generators don't have to comply. It's the distribution utilities that have to comply. And so they have to make sure that they have bought enough credits from clean energy sources, or from each of the tiers, from sources from each of the tiers, to satisfy their credits. In tier 1, they will be able to purchase out-of-state credits, but the percentage of those credits that can come from out of state is going to be ramped down over time. So that by 2050, all of them will have to be in state. So the idea is that you could, if you required all in-state clean energy right away, because we are so far behind in Pennsylvania, and we currently rank 50th in the percentage of our electricity that comes from renewable energy out of 51 states and territories, we would likely not hit our targets for many years, and we'd end up paying that alternative compliance credit, which is more expensive for consumers and doesn't directly lead to more clean energy. So yes, out-of-state credits can be used for compliance, but in terms of carbon pollution, it's still driving new generation, just not driving the in-state generation that carries some of the economic benefits that a number of stakeholders care about.
Nancy, would you like to ask your question since you are on camera? Or would you like me to read it?
Yeah, I can do this. Yeah, I put into the chat that I'd like to know, Tom, what has been discussed as the time period over which we would like to see carbon reductions phased in under PACER. And by what method would that be done?
Yeah, I mean, ideally, if we are listening to the climate scientists, we would want them phased in very quickly, and we would essentially get to a completely zero carbon grid by about 2035. That's not politically feasible. So what we're going to do is we're going to push for the biggest reductions we can get. The method for doing that is going to, if PACER is passed, in the immediate like 4 months after it's passed, we can try to push DEP to revise the schedule of the emissions reductions to make it more ambitious than what it is right now. And I think there's a good case to be made there, just because a number of coal-fired power plants have retired even since those targets were adopted. And a few more are set to retire in the next few years. And so I think the case can already be made that the caps under RGGI are too high. After that, it doesn't specify how often those credits have to be revisited. And so what we would have to do is, if we wanted to, we could try to leverage RGGI and the regional market to say, like, look, we need to ratchet our emissions downwards so that we're complying with this, and we are making our credits tradable. I don't know how convincing that's going to be. And so that's one of those things that I think we would want to try to get PACER amended to have a review schedule for those limits.
Yeah, I mean, we know from experience that nothing happens until the last moment if you don't put in interim phases. So, you know, I'm going to have a hard time supporting PACER without a specific set in statutory language of reductions.
I can add a little bit to what Tom was just saying. Also, is it does have in there. Now this isn't what you're looking for, but I just wanted to mention that it does have 120 days after the effective date. DEP has to do an evaluation on the budget trading program.
It's 4 months.
Now,
Okay.
that isn't, we'll say, maybe as optimistic as what we're looking for when it comes to environmental, because that's a multi-factor evaluation. So they're taking into consideration jobs, electricity consumers, and the environment when it comes to how the base budget is impacting Pennsylvania. So as much as we wish environment was the priority, that's going to consider all three of those factors.
All right. I hear you. It's just that PACER's not going to work without it.
All right, I am going to just do a time check. If anyone does need to leave, I recognize that it is 7 o'clock. So long as Tom is able to continue to take questions, I think we can still get to Robin's. But if anyone does need to leave, these questions will be included in the recording that goes out. And I'm also going to include the whole chat. So if your question was answered in the chat and you want a record of that, you will also get that in your email. So no worries if you need to leave right now. Thank you so much for coming this evening, and enjoy your night. With that, Robin, go ahead.
Thank you. Really appreciate this program. And please feel free to just point me to some reading, because I think I don't quite understand, but I was wondering about the distributed generation and whether or not there's going to need to be a PUC ruling to kind of make distributed generation sort of qualify. And I mean, how is that going to be incorporated? I'm just not clear on that, because it seems like a huge opportunity with solar for all and all that stuff, but are there hurdles that we need to get through for that to work? And I really mean it. If somebody could just point me to something to read about it, that'd be great.
Yeah, I think I don't have the language in front of me. I think that there is some specificity in the bill definitions as to what qualifies as distributed, and maybe Nate can shed some light on that. But I don't believe, and the PUC has done some rulemaking on what qualifies and what doesn't in the past, and I don't think this bill would change that at all. I think what it does do is it moves non-solar distributed generation from tier 2 into tier 1. And it also qualifies geothermal that is used for purposes other than electricity generation. So, you know, your heat pump geothermal would qualify for credits, and that could potentially be a new type of distributed generation. That how exactly that works is not entirely clear, and I do think the PUC would have to weigh in on how those credits are determined.
Peter?
Yeah, I'm just kind of curious, Tom, if you have any information. I keep reading that you know, wind power and solar power are competitive with, if not less expensive than fossil fuels in general. What's the situation in Pennsylvania? How close are we to that being true, or is that already true? And if it's already true, why aren't distributors saying, I want more solar, I want more wind because it's better for my customers?
Yeah. So this is actually the subject of a rate case in PICO territory right now. So we are trying to get PICO as kind of a test case to buy more wind and solar than is required by the current AEPS. And the problem is that so the short answer to your question is yes, they are competitive even in Pennsylvania. The problem is that there are a whole bunch of soft costs and sort of systems that still benefit fossil fuels, right? And so, for example, when utilities have to purchase their default supply, right? So that's the electricity you get from them if you don't sign up for your own chosen electricity supplier in Pennsylvania. They are required by the PUC to use relatively short-term contracts in order to satisfy that demand. And the reason why they have to be shorter is because you have less of a risk premium built into gas and coal-fired electricity, right? Because a lot of the electricity cost is fuel. But with wind and solar, there is no fuel cost. Therefore, the cost of developing that energy is all capital, and a lot of it is interest rates, right? And I was getting kind of wonky, but like, if you are a developer and you want to get the lowest cost for your system, you want to, or the lowest cost of borrowing, you want to say, I have X%, some large percent of this energy committed to be purchased over the long term, right? And so what we're saying is PICO needs to use long-term contracts to buy that. And when they are using long-term contracts, they're going to get better rates for clean energy because the interest rates will be much lower. And that's even more true now than it was previously, now that the cost of borrowing is so much higher now than it was a few years ago.
Okay, any final questions? Thank you to Tom and Nate for fielding the questions we've had, and Nate for answering all those questions in the chat as we went along. If there are no final questions, my final question is, who wore the cartoon chef's hat best? Vote now in the chat or send me an email. I think Shapiro looks pretty good with it on, but I don't know. So thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Thank you, Sarah, for keeping us on our toes and answering everyone's questions in the chat as well and putting the links in. I appreciate you all. Have a wonderful, wonderful evening.